Eumeswil by Ernst Jünger, 1977. Produced by Parker Banks at pbanks.net and youtube.com/pbanks. Concerning the forest. 47. I return to my job in the Casbah. From the bar I can see the condor. He looks nonchalant and nearly always cheerful, though sometimes exhausted too. At his right, the domo is Odysseus with a mossy goatee that sharpens rather than conceals his profile. At his left, Attila, the unicorn with the white, undulating fleece. When drinking, he runs his hand down the flow of his beard. I would count him among the centaurs, not dichotomous, but twofold. The guests change from day to day. A few are summoned late at night through the phonophore if the discussion requires their presence. On the side benches, the minions. Each one's eyes are glued to his master. If he has drained his glass, the minion brings it to me without being asked and carries the fresh drink back. First, the chef. The dinner was as simple and exquisite as ever. He submits the suggestion for the next one. The condor crosses out the dessert, substituting another. A small band has been playing on the estrade, and sometimes its leader comes in. The domo sends for him when he is particularly satisfied, but also if he is bothered by anything. He is hard to please. They discuss nuances that are beyond my ken. I would like to hear the note, not the instrument. The note should flow more lightly. The violinist was not informed tonight. He's got problems at home. That can happen. It is easier for me to follow when the critique touches on principles of physics. You have to show more respect for the preceding pause. I do not quite know what you mean, Excellency. I mean the pause that comes before you start playing, not the intervals within a performance. That pause is indicated by my raising the baton. No, that is already a visible sign. Imagine a ladder. When you raise the baton, you have already reached the first rung. What comes before is the preliminary pause. Why did that make perfect sense to me? Most likely because it touched on a general artistic problem. The painter, too, stares at the white surface for a while. The poet ruminates silently until his tongue loosens. Perhaps during this hush they are closer to perfection than in the execution, however the work may turn out. The domo apparently meant that one should wait for the euphon, or rather wait to be prepared for it. Of course, this applies to the composer more than to the performer, especially before a dinner. I still have no concept of Attila's age or background. Sometimes I categorize him among the mythical figures. This involves timelessness. Then again, he reminds me of a certain Comte de Saint-Germain who claimed to be in possession of the elixir of eternal youth and also told about feasting with Alexander the Great. Initially, I thought Attila was one of those doctors who cultivate an uncouth tone while associating with officers. Whenever his tongue loosened, anecdotes like this one contributed to my assumption. Beards change with the fashions. Men often imitate the current monarch. Well, I'm beyond all that. He nodded at the condor. I have often worn a beard like this one, whether on a patriarchal impulse or on an anarchic one. During the first war I fought in, I was a beardless youth. It was the only time I swore an oath of allegiance prior to military service. I mean the only allegiance that I observed. After that I swore a lot of oaths, either to gain an advantage or to sidestep a disadvantage. Even the Hippocratic oath was more of a general guideline. Oaths are like virginity. It was after a lost war that I began wearing the beard I have today. It was already white. As a doctor I had seen and learned a lot. A great military hospital station is a kind of gateway to hell. The city was occupied by the Yellow Khan's troops and it was already relatively calm. My beard helped me. It made me a venerable personage in the eyes of the Tartars. They were soon referring to me as the general. On the other hand, I noticed that our young men found me offensive. They viewed me as a kind of protest figure. They would insult me, yell curses at me. It did not faze me. I lost patience only once when a man stood in my way and seized my beard with both hands. I grabbed his shoulders, pushed him around and kicked him through a store window. The only damage he could do was to the glass, since the shelves were empty and showing no more than a picture of the Yellow Khan. After that, I felt unsafe. The boys formed groups and got violent. I got anonymous threats. I asked to see the commander, and he received me benevolently. He was enthroned among a luxurious medley of looted furnishings. I kowtowed to him. In this connection, I must remark that I was already way beyond esteeming resistance as a moral achievement. Those are liberal reminiscences, recipes for suicides who save the police some work. Here there is only one kind of behavior, that of the chameleon. This Greek word means earth lion. I swore allegiance once, I resisted once. Nation and king have no further claims on me. General, what brings you to me? What can I do for you? Commander, I'm being threatened. They resent me for treating your wounded, for tending them. I would like to continue my work, and so I'm asking you for a weapon to protect myself with. He shook his head. It would be better if you gave me the names of these pests. You can count on never seeing them again. Unfortunately, I don't know them. I did know them, of course, and I also owned a weapon that I had stowed in a safe place. But one sticks to the rules, and indeed plays on both sides as long as one can. Besides, I had done a discreet service for the commander. A physician is something of a father confessor. Very well, my friend, I'll make an exception in your case. And so I got a pistol and, most importantly, a gun permit. One should resort to illegality as late as possible. The city park lay between my home and the military hospital. After a long workday, I was crossing the park in the darkness. The guy I had catapulted through the window stood in my way. I released the safety catch. He held a cigar toward me in his left hand. Hey, old goat, do you have a light? Sorry, I don't smoke. Next came a haymaker that knocked me to the ground. Pardonnez-moi, mon vieux, here's my lighter. And sprawling there, I fired through my pocket and gave him something to remember me by. The memory would linger on. Slanting shots, slanting from below, leave complicated wounds. I then went over to the others and ordered them to lie on their bellies. They had become as meek as lambs. I touched the back of each neck with the mouth of the barrel. The Tartars used this approach during an interrogation in order to break resistance. Just as the Romans made their defeated pass under a yoke, once was enough. I had nothing more to fear from them, at least so long as we were occupied. However, most of these young men are offspring of prestigious families. They revolt against the fathers who let themselves be conquered, and that was how they pigeonholed me. I would have gotten along with them if they had understood me. But life is short, and I prefer wine to cider. After a while, I felt it was advisable to fold my tents. One night, taking 2 pistols, I crossed over to the other side. There I had friends and patrons. We went back a long way. A Mauritanian finds a set table everywhere. Moreover, there are natural gifts. A talented doctor, singer, hetera are popular with both friend and foe. Like Bias de Prienne, they carry their belongings with them. They are born with a global passport in their mouths. 48. During these late-night conversations, Attila acts the bon vivant, like someone recounting youthful pranks that he no longer takes seriously, but with which he occasionally entertains others. The peculiar thing about it is the frankness of his comments on tyranny. This may be due to his position of authority. Besides, he is speaking to messmates who are sure of themselves. The Condor and the Domo unabashedly go along with this tone. Something similar can be found in the self-irony of intelligent Jews. It eases, nay, brightens the conversation. I have gathered a number of such anecdotes as are heard in veterans' groups. Oddly enough, Attila barely mentions the period of his studies, yet he must have spent many years in laboratories. They are bound to be registered in his papers. The Domo sometimes alludes to them. Attila must have played a major role in the era of transplants, when medical science attempted grafts on natural growth. It was not only as Uranians that the new sons of Prometheus realized their hour had struck. There could be 2 reasons for Attila's reticence. Either he views his experiments as excesses that had a repulsive outcome and should therefore be hushed up, or else they were successful beyond all measure. Silence is also called for with the discovery of a gold mine. Perhaps the answer was mightier than the question. A miracle snuffed out the experiment. A master tried to outfox nature, and an explosion corroborated his work, destroying it at the same time. Such is the course of evocations. The preliminaries are intricate. When the mind enters, the intricacies become superfluous, and people would rather forget the technical detail. I perk up my ears when Attila, at a late hour, ventures beyond the boundaries, into the polar sea, the great deserts, the forest. I can barely distinguish between geography and dreams, but that already applies to our Eumeswil. The reality of everyday life blurs. It merges into the reality of dreams. Now one reality, now the other penetrates the consciousness more sharply. I have reconstructed some of these places from fragments, for instance, the grey castle of Transisserland. Guesswork, even mistakes are inevitable. Those are some of the weaknesses of our science. Wellsprings spurt only once in time. It was after one of the great devastations. Years had gone by. The desert, which had already been sparsely planted, was now thoroughly burned out. The caravan trails were lined with human and animal skeletons. The bones gleamed like opals in the sun. They were calcined. It was not decay that had bleached them. The flesh must have been devoured instantly. The earthen huts in oases, the houses around drilling rigs had melted in a similar fashion. The clay and the stones were vitrified. The walls bore the silhouettes of palms, camels, and people as shadows cast by the radiation that had followed the fire. The upper drill pipe of one derrick dangled as if a fountain had petrified. A cannon barrel was twisted like a hose. Steel drops lay in the sand underneath. Catastrophes, too, have a style of their own. I was alone. Some of my companions had given up after the early marching because they could not deal with the horrors. A lot of them must have died of thirst or perished in the contaminated valleys. Once again, I was the last. This is one of the experiences of old age. A man grows tired of outliving. I don't know how I reached the forest. Cloudbursts must have filled up the old water holes. I was also moving away from the eye of the destruction. The first vultures were circling in the air. Then I saw plants and animals, including some that were new to me. A few of them evoked pictures in old fable books, as if a demiurge had patched them together. It is well known that people on exhausting marches have visions. On the other hand, these creatures reminded me of experiments I had dealt with for a long time, and perhaps this memory projected them into the desert and magnified them. Such recollections can also become realities. After all, every experiment is a realized reminiscence. The forest stood like a rampart. No axe could ever have touched it. The cataclysm must have intensified its growth, as if the breath of the fire and the subsequent deluge had liberated its primal energy. This would speak for Cuvier's theory. Seed trees had shot up to an acme, surpassing the highest towers. Others had spread foliage that could have provided shade for a whole army. It was not until later that I noticed something bizarre in their interweaving. The branches had copulated. In and of itself, this is nothing new for the botanist or for the gardener who inoculates. I once knew a man in Saxony who had grown 7 varieties of fruit on a single trunk. But the extraordinary thing about the forest was the promiscuity of the mixing. Entirely alien species had coupled, and their fruit would have made Linnaeus tear his hair out had he seen them. That, too, reminded me of the laboratories. We had succeeded, if I may call it that, in begetting gigantic growth, multi-armed creatures like Hindu gods, multi-breasted females like the Diana of Ephesus. Groping our way through genetic mazes, we had awakened forebears that we had known only from marl pits and slate quarries. But protean winds were blowing here, and throughout the forest they had achieved something that we had spent so much effort trying to attain in our laboratories. I sensed it directly, almost like an alchemist who, already despairing of the great transmutation, sees solid gold shining in his kiln. I felt myself drawn into the metamorphosis, into a new world, and my experiences did not confirm the details until later. The road back from the tree of knowledge to the tree of life is a sinister one, but there was no returning to the desert that lay behind me. There, death was certain. Despite the risk of getting lost in the forest, I had to cross through it to reach the open sea. Like every jungle, the forest was surrounded by a girdle of dense, partly thorny underbrush. It was more negotiable in the deep shade, but there the foliage covered up the sun, the only thing that could indicate my direction. I must have wandered in circles for a long time, naked and with ripped skin like a castaway. The thorns had shredded my clothes and my body. I found springs and brooks from which I could drink, and also fruits and berries that I took a wild chance on. Perhaps their virtues were imbued with the visions produced by fever, imposing imaginary trials of strength on me. Once I had to avoid an army of termites. They were enormous and marching toward an obelisk that was shooting sparks from its tip. The snakes that traveled in the trees overhead were also huge. They seemed neither to glide nor to fly. The edges of their skin were shimmying. They were clearly demonstrating the transition to dragons. They mated with the trunks, enclasping them. Blood-red resin or resinous blood flowed from the fissures struck by their claws. I did not miss my binoculars. Every scale was stamped on my mind. It also appeared that the kind of sensitivity that we only see in mimosas had become universal there. One of the trees had fruit like that of our maples. Our children pin them on their noses and call the tips little wings. That is a pure metaphor. In the forest it became operative. The fruits did not whirl to the ground. They fluttered. A tumult of tiny bats was celebrating a wedding around the trunk. A man could strike roots here and become a tree. In a clearing, a sunbeam fell upon a ram-like shape. Its left front leg was propped on a lamb with a human face. Both dissolved in light as if the vision were too powerful. And then again islands of thicket along the windbreaks. A path had been trodden into one, an animal trail. Lethally exhausted, I blindly groped my way along. The path led to an open space. A cypress was growing there, its height beyond imagining. Had the sky been cloudy, I would not have seen the tip of the tree. Its trunk was hollow. The entrance to the interior was not weathered. A rectangle had been cut into the alburnum, like a gateway. Trees are our best friends. I ventured inside. Through the darkness, I reached the interior on all fours. The floor was covered with furs, or rather a fleece that seemed to have grown on the back of an animal. A marvelous bed. I stretched out and instantly fell into a death-like sleep. I don't know how long I rested there. When I awoke, I felt reborn, as if I had bathed in the fountain of youth. The air was delicious. It smelled of cypress wood whose resin is smouldering into incense. The morning sun fell through the wooden gateway. I sat up. My skin glistened. The blood had been washed away and there was no trace of the thorns. I must have been dreaming. But meanwhile someone had taken care of me. What is meanwhile? A pause between two instants or even between two forms of existence. A garment was lying at my side, a kind of burnous. It was woven of the same gold as the carpet. Next to it there were sandals and a tray with bread and wine. A large and undeserved bestowal. Wherever it came from, no response was possible but prayer. Attila seldom reaches this point, and then more often in monologues. Gaps are interspersed in the meanwhile. Sometimes he even gets lost in scientific or mythological digressions. For instance, about cedar wood, which was once considered indestructible. It used to be employed for temples and ships, for cradles and coffins, and even for the burning of the dead. However, it strikes me that for him, its mythical significance outweighs its botanical one. Cedar, cypress, arbor vitae, juniper were confused, just like mountains such as Atlas, Zion, Sinai, and also ranges in the New World. Apparently he considers Yggdrasil not an ash tree but a cypress. Thus, the word has less of a biological than a cosmogonic meaning for him. I note this detail because I initially found it hard to delve into the background of his language until I finally realized that it makes things simpler rather than more complicated. He takes them back to their synthesis. That is how I explain the impact he has on the round table. A silvery figure, he constitutes its center. Even the domo is illuminated. They have drunk a lot. I am the only sober person here. I concentrate on his forehead. I see the horn arching forth as if from a bud. He strokes the condor's hand, almost like a father. It could also be the gesture of a father-in-law. He stops talking about the forest. When he gets to the sea, he will become more loquacious. It could not have been that far away. The path led from metahistorical to ahistorical landscapes, from the forest to the chaotic shore. What he reported did not sound good. It even sounded hopeless. One of the symbols of places without a history is refuse. Space is menaced by garbage. Waste is no longer coped with as in civilized countries. It outgrows the structures. When a ship founders, the wreckage drifts ashore. The mast, the planks are used for building shacks or as fuel. People live on top of and from the refuse among garbage heaps that they exploit. Naked hunger follows bygone wealth and its lavishness. Growth fails to keep pace. At first, thoughts are twisted, then actions become ominous. There are 4 tokens. One such sign, according to Attila, is the passion, a humanist legacy, for excavations. Something like subterranean cargo cults began back then. Only the graves contributed artworks. The disempowerment of the gods progressed at the same rate. Then came the exploitation of fossil remains, followed by earthquakes and the destruction of primeval forests by the hunger for energy. Even the ocean became a dumping ground. The ash tree was no longer bent, it was chopped down. The degenerates whose behavior Attila studied in the great dump site lived there in dugouts. They were virtually unclad and unarmed. That is how mushrooms live on the chlorophyll of other plants. As gatherers and hunters, they grubbed for roots and set traps for small animals. Unable to work either stone or wood, they used them in whatever way they fit into their hands. That was also how they utilized the vestiges of metal utensils and machine parts. They seemed barely alive, drowsing in a dreamlike state, as in the days before Prometheus had given them fire. The heir to the last man is not the primitive, but the zombie. Clearly Attila had given them medical attention, but without success. Now and then pirates would land and hunt them down in order to try out the weapons that they had obtained from uncontaminated bunkers, and they carried off a few people in order to reconnoiter those same bunkers. As slaves, the captives were useless. 49. Today I was faced with a decision that may herald my departure from Eumeswil. When Kung brought in my breakfast, he also had the work schedule. The domo was commanding me to report to him at 11 o'clock. In mufti. Still in my bathrobe, I mulled it over while the Chinese laid out my things. This order could spell trouble. Perhaps they had overheard conversations in which Darlin had boasted to me of his nihilistic attacks. Or had they discovered my bunker on the upper Seuss? I would present the former as a curiosity, the latter as a private pleasure. There was nothing to reproach in my work. I had served that night as usual, and the Condor had dismissed me benevolently. So there was nothing serious to fear. Besides, in such cases one is not summoned, one is taken. The domo received me at his desk. He was obviously very busy, but concentrating as always. That morning, as it happened, I had recognized my real image in the mirror. It stared at me as though receiving some pleasant news. I had perused its face during many nights. Venator, you know how much we appreciate you, both in your work up here and as a historian. You read nothing superfluous into history. The Condor knew what he was doing when he allowed you to use the great luminar. It was a sign of trust and also reliance. Then he got to the point. The Condor has decided to go on a great hunt. It will take him beyond the desert and into the woods. I'm now arranging the preliminaries. We will set out shortly. Along with the hunters and the usual escort, I have decided to take along a small staff of scholars, including Rosner as zoologist and you as historian. The donkeys and the scholars in the middle. You know the quotation, but joking aside, we regard you as our Xenophon, that is, if you are willing. He may have wanted to add something, but then limited himself to a hint. I am uneasy about the whole thing. It could go almost anywhere. He was alluding to Attila. The fact that the domo had thought of a zoologist and a historian indicates that he wants to keep the hunt within both natural and human boundaries, whatever the dangers. This is also evidenced by his own participation, given how indispensable he is here. He turned to the side in order to get the phonophore for his next report. I saw his head in profile. The close beard sharpens and elongates the chin slightly. That is where the horn seems to start, not on the forehead as with Attila. The domo's beard shone moss green as demanded by the red rock of the Citadel Mountain. Life is a chain of optical illusions, but this one fitted him. If any of us escapes, then it will be the domo. He will not get involved with gods. He gave me time to think it over. For tactical reasons, I agreed to sleep on it, though I had made up my mind on the spot. This opens one of the two roads leading out of the city, if only into an intermediary realm, an antechamber. I will stick not to the Domo, for whom the catacombs are more suitable, but to Attila. He will precede the Condor, functioning as a marriage broker. Vigo was the only person whom I might consult before saying yes. I got time off from the Kasbah and went to see him in his garden that evening. He promptly understood that this hunt is more than an expedition. Of course, every hunt has its Caledonian background. Vigo's assessment of the situation had a historical foundation. The great goal of the political will is Leviathan. This goal has been more or less achieved. It is necessary in late eras, as under the Caesars, or in the world state as the consequence of technological perfection. Two peaks. One grew from the personal will, the other from the collective will. In the one, the god Caesar. In the other, Homo Magnus as Titan. One is tied to the animal, the other to Plutonian energy. This is shown in the symbols, eagle and lion as opposed to colors and tools. The world state is shattered into its parts, just as Boutefeu predicted. We are left with diadochic realms and epigonic city-states. The keynote proclaimed by the 19th Christian century was a permanent, indeed qualitative growth. This seemed to be realized by Homo Faber in the 20th century. Next, new distinctions split off from progress, and they can be roughly described as the differences between economists and ecologists. The former thought in terms of the history of the world, the latter the history of the earth. The former thought in terms of distribution, the latter in terms of administration. Conflicts erupted between the human milieu and the natural environment, and they were exacerbated by the apocalyptic atmosphere that recurs at the end of every millennium. The concentration of power likewise occurs toward the end of an era. This time it was inevitably of a technological nature. Again, speaking roughly, that is, in the framework of classical science, we might say that on the one side biologists were rearming and on the other physicists. One side strove toward the organic grid, the other toward the material grid, genes versus atoms. This led below not only the historical but also the human fundaments, forest versus underworld. People were skeptical about everything but science. This was the only thing that developed unswervingly and worldwide. It ultimately consumed the state. Science managed to do something that had been reserved for the great titans who had existed before the gods, indeed created them. In order to recognize these goals, which were hidden even from science itself, it had to reach a limit at which death and life offered a new response. Vigo said, "Martin, I have never doubted that you prefer the forest. Yet I also know that you regard it as a passage, not as a goal, like Attila, or as a fiction like the Domo. But what are fictions? A dream comes true in each of our great transformations. You know this as a historian. We fail not because of our dreams, but because we do not dream forcefully enough. Attila has calculated the favorable moment. We will march at night, starting tomorrow in the full moon. The advance units have already gone ahead with the tents. Meanwhile, I have paid my goodbye visits, also calling on my dear old dad, who naturally tried to talk me out of going. He sees this undertaking as something between adventure and charlatanry. Bruno likewise expressed doubts. He would have preferred my heading toward the catacombs. I also went to see Latifa and Ingrid and took another dip in the ocean with its warm and cold currents. Latifa received a bouquet of flowers this time instead of a scudo. My choice hit home. I felt it in my very marrow. Inner warmth was released. Ingrid likewise amazed me by shedding her clothes for the first time. I did justice to the surprise. I then bid farewell to my refuge on the upper Sus. The entrance was already overgrown. Soon it will be spun shut. I had gone there to stow away the notes I have gathered at the night bar. They can be deciphered at most by Bruno. I am leaving my scholarly works at the Institute. They are chiefly sketches. In regard to these jottings, I considered burning them. They weigh on my mind, if only because they are incomplete. A sense of inadequacy casts a shadow on my existence, both as a historian and as a man. Nevertheless, the destruction of a manuscript is a kind of spiritual suicide, whereby I am not putting down suicide. However, I was held back by an experience that concerned that very shadow. During those days, I worked intensively at the mirror in order to prepare myself for the forest. I thus managed to achieve something I had always dreamed of, a complete detachment from my physical existence. I saw myself in the mirror as a transcendent suitor, and myself confronting him as his fleeting mirror image. Between us, as always, a candle burned. I leaned over it until the flames singed my forehead. I saw the injury, but I did not feel the pain. When Kung arrived with my breakfast, he found me stretched out naked on the floor. The Chinese are masters of killing and reviving. He brought me to with hot towels and powerful essences. He swore he would keep silent. Had it not been for the stigma on my brow, I would have thought I had been dreaming. Epilogue. My brother, Martin Venator, who vanished years ago with the tyrant and his retinue, has now been declared legally dead. Our father was correct in urgently warning him not to join that undertaking. We already saw it as the last resort of a ruler who had lost the game. Meanwhile, a great deal has changed in the city, and if I may say so, for the better. The Kasbah is now desolate. Goatherds pasture their goats inside the walls of the stronghold. The exiles have returned from abroad, and the prisoners from the islands. The henchmen of the tyranny have traded places with them. As my brother's sole heir, I have the responsibility of administering his posthumous papers. They include the studies that he deposited at the Historical Institute, of which I have now become director. He described them, perhaps all too modestly, as sketches. I am having them edited. We were surprised by the papers just recently discovered in the wilderness along the Upper Sus. Hunters pursuing a buffalo found them in a bunker next to weapons and provisions. If the party had not included a scholar, they would no doubt have burned the manuscripts. But this way they came into my hands. We deplored and disliked the subaltern work he performed in the Kasbah. However, this hiding place, which cost him a great deal of effort, testifies to his skepticism and his spiritual resistance. He would certainly have also resisted in deed. It would have been better had he confided in us and our friends. The bulk of his papers consists of a throng of dated or undated scraps, accounts and jottings about his nocturnal activity, interspersed with passages in hieroglyphic style. Bruno, to whom he specifically refers, has emigrated. Supposedly, he has an important position in the catacombs, and then these notebooks to which I am adding the epilogue. They are more readable, despite the often rapid penmanship. However, I am almost as familiar with his handwriting as with my own. There are things people simply have in common that cannot be denied. Reading these pages has thrown me into an inner conflict between the private man and the historian. My brother did not love his family, such was his peculiar character, but we loved him. His presentation is larded with judgments and, in my opinion, misjudgments that would justify my burning it as a private person. I have thought about it. Burnings take place with every legacy, perhaps to purge the deceased's image in our memories, perhaps for the sake of his family. I, however, am a historian, and come from a family of historians. My dear brother, one of the titles he loved was Historian by Blood. There is an archivist's conscience to which a man must sacrifice himself. I am submitting to it by sealing these pages and storing them at the Institute.